Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but welcome to episode number 70. It has been so fun, and I know I say this a lot on Instagram and on episodes of the podcast, but it's been amazing getting to share my love of Nancy Drew, whether it's through the books, the games, TV shows, movies, whatever it is. It's been so fun to, I guess, quote unquote, nerd out with you guys, and I'm so glad that this community is here and that I've found all these other people that love Nancy Drew like I do. And 70 episodes, I knew I would get into reading the books and covering so much Nancy Drew related content, but I just am so glad to be here and glad that you guys are here and love listening, and just wanted to say thank you again from the bottom of my heart. So for today's episode of the podcast, we're continuing our talk on the 1970s Nancy Drew / Hardy Boys show, and we're on season 1, episode 8, A Haunting We Will Go. So at the start of this episode, we open to Nancy and a woman, and they're having a very tense interaction, and the woman is like, "I'm sick of your meddling," and she pulls out this knife, and honestly, I thought Nancy was about to get stabbed by this Professor Hotchkiss lookalike, because this woman could be Beatrice Hotchkiss's twin. She has the short reddish-orange hair, and if you remember, we talked about Treasure in the Royal Tower, the computer game, back in episode 66, and Professor Hotchkiss is a character from that computer game, but this woman, like, if they had cast like a movie version of Treasure in the Royal Tower, she could totally pull off Hotchkiss. So we're watching this woman stalk towards Nancy with this knife, and then Nancy ducks and she stabs this armoire, like this dresser behind her, and then it cuts to these theater seats, and we realize, oh, okay, Nancy's just in a play. She's not like actually in any danger. So it turns out that Ned is producing this play called Murder in the Fourth Act, and so he runs out onto stage after Nancy and this actress call cut and they're done rehearsing, and he says, "Oh, this famous actress Thelma March is coming, and she said she wants to be in the play." So the red-haired actress, I think her name is Janet, you can tell there's just a huge change in her demeanor, and she's like not happy about hearing the fact that Thelma March is coming, and so you're kind of like, okay, is she afraid she's going to get upstaged? Do they have some kind of beef in the theater industry between each other? And we'll find out more about that later. So she leaves rather abruptly, and then Nancy, Ned, and George walk off the stage, and Nancy is going on and on about the fact that they're doing this play to raise money because apparently they're going to tear the theater down. They're going to put a youth facility up in place of it, like something that benefits younger people. So they're closing up the theater for the night and turning all the lights off, and Nancy says, "I'll go back out and turn off all the stage lights." And it's while she's out there that we see somebody up in the rafters meddling with the lights, and Nancy almost has a chandelier dropped on her. Of course, Nancy downplays it because that's what Nancy Drew does. Like, if she ever gets hit in the head or almost hit by a flying object, she's like, it's no big deal. But this whole scene really reminded me of the Final Scene computer game, which we haven't covered yet on the podcast, but we will be doing soon, and Message in a Haunted Mansion, another computer game. It really reminded me of the Final Scene because it takes place in a theater, much like in that game, and we also have like a Klieg light almost fall on us in that game. And then Message in a Haunted Mansion, of course, there's this chandelier that can drop and hit people, and so just really reminded me of those two games. So the episode then cuts back to Nancy and George at Nancy's house, and Carson is really concerned about Nancy, and he's like, "How did that even happen? Didn't somebody check the rigging?" And Nancy's like, "It's fine, it's not a big deal." And then George speaks up and said, "Well, Janet says it's the spirit that haunts the theater." And then Carson is like, "Well, people like Janet, of course they want to nurture that it's hauntings and not man-made problems. but the Rialto is the name of the theater. And apparently Janet lives right across the street, like right across this alleyway from the theater. So we file that away for later. So it's while they're talking about the fact that Janet used to be in plays back in the theater's golden age that Ned runs in and he says, "Hey, I got telegrams from all these famous people that want to be involved in our play." And he lists a few of their names. I think their names are Alex Richmond, Danny Day, and Seth Taylor. But the really weird thing about it is that these are big actors. Like, I think one guy is a major actor, the other one's a news reporter, and the other he's like a host for TV game shows. But Nancy's like, why would these people come to help us put on a small play at a tiny little town like River Heights? So the next thing to happen is Nancy and George go back to the theater earlier before all of these famous people are supposed to show up, and they investigate why the chandelier fell, and Nancy finds what looks like a cut rope, and she goes up to the top of the scaffolding, and she says to George, there's no way that this came untied on its own. And obviously a ghost didn't do it, so Nancy goes down to the prop room to explore, and she's opening this trunk, and it really reminded me of the Mystery of the Brass Bound Trunk. I thought this was kind of neat. But Nancy finds all these old programs, and it happens to be that all the actors who are showing up were in the original run of the play that they're putting on in 1957. So are they all feeling sentimental for their glory days, or is there something more sinister to this? So the next thing to happen in the episode is that all of these famous actors start showing up, and Thelma and Janet, they're very cold to each other, and you can tell that there's some kind of sinister undercurrent to their relationships. Like, they are here for a reason. What it is, we don't know. It may not be because of the play, but they really don't like each other. And Carson is up there on the stage with them, and he says, we're going to get a lot of press because, this small town play has now gotten all these big names in it. And so he offers to help them find a hotel to stay at. And they say, oh no, we want to stay at the Excelsior next door, which is where Janet apparently lives. And she does not seem very happy about this. Now, during a couple of these scenes, Nancy keeps walking in on a couple of the actors' different pairings, and they're all arguing about something. And so she tells George, if this was a scene from the play, I don't remember it. Nancy also sees Janet, and I think it's Seth Taylor, having an argument where Seth, they almost get violent with each other, and she interrupts them, and they say, oh, yeah, that was great work on that scene. And Nancy just gets this weird feeling about it. But she kind of just pushes it aside, and she says, hey, we need you guys for rehearsal at 7. Now, while the rehearsals are going on, Nancy is kind of whispering in Ned's ear in the wings of the stage, and she says, what is with that Richmond guy? He has a really threadbare suitcase. He came here by bus. I thought he was supposed to be well off. And Ned's like, maybe he's frugal. He also tells Nancy that she's constantly trying to be a detective when there's no mysteries around, and I thought this was kind of snippy of him, but then he's like, you just missed your cue. So Nancy goes out in the middle of the scene and hands everyone their drinking glasses, and then when the scene wraps up, I think it's Seth Taylor, he says, I'm gonna go get my pipe and smoke it. He ends up going down into the basement, and then this huge statue falls on him. It was about this point in watching the episode that I started thinking, this episode gives me such Agatha Christie vibes, very much like Murder on the Orient Express. There's this group of people, and they're all conspiring to do something, but what? So they all go to check on Mr. Taylor, and everybody's speculating. Thelma's like, maybe the statue just fell on you on accident, and then someone else is like, maybe it was pushed onto you, and then Janet's like, it's the goddess Minerva, because apparently there was a statue up on the theater at one point, so she's just throwing her suspicions into the pot. But Nancy examines the room where Taylor fell and where the statue fell on him, and they see that this light bulb is not screwed in properly, so it was pitch black. No wonder he fell and the statue toppled down on him. But then she looks at this window, and it looks like it's been messed with. The lock has, but Taylor's like, nobody could have fit through there. So after the rehearsal is finished, Nancy goes home, and she's talking to Carson, and she's speculating about all of this, and Carson's like, well, as far as the chandelier goes, it's a 50-year-old plus theater. Maybe the ropes just disintegrated and over time they got weaker. And so he has an explanation for everything that she is suspicious of. But Nancy's like, I just can't get it out of my head that something's going on because these people are so hostile towards each other. So Carson volunteers this theory and he says, well, maybe they're jealous of each other. And he says, it's not uncommon for lawyers that I know to get jealous of each other. People are basically all the same. And he says, actors are just normal people. And it's after this line is delivered that we see all of the actors at the theater and they're acting really, really weird. They're like digging in the walls, they're hating on each other and sniping at each other. And so it's just very, very interesting. What are they looking for? We do get a really funny scene of Nancy and Ned riding around in this car together, and Nancy is kind of like trying to get Ned to come down because he has this ego throughout this episode, like he's a theatrical genius. And Nancy's like, I thought you wanted to be a lawyer. The next thing to happen is Ned shows up at the theater and he catches Thelma and some of the actors in the middle of something, and he's like, why are you guys here? And they gave him some bogus thing like, oh, we're just rehearsing after hours. Sure you are, and you're covered in dust because you've been digging in the theater walls. But the next morning, Nancy and Ned are staring at all of these actors. They're all laying in various places all across the floor of the backstage area. And Nancy's like, this is just how I found them. Like, why did they sleep here last night? So Ned yells really loud to wake them all up and he's like, good morning. And then Thelma jumps awake and she's like, oh, Ted. The next note that I have down has nothing to do with the plot so much as it does George's dress in this episode. She's wearing a blue dress for this part of the episode and I really dig it. Now the next scene we cut to everybody in Carson's office and Nancy is telling her dad more of her suspicions, and Carson is again kind of dismissing them. And that's one thing I really didn't like about this episode. It kind of bothered me how Carson didn't believe Nancy at first, but he believes millionaires apparently. Carson basically says that they're all respected talents and Nancy shouldn't suspect them. And then he also says after she leaves the room, because she's kind of upset because no one believes her, he says, oh, well, maybe she's just having some stage fright. She's working with all these respected actors. No, there's all these weird things happening, and it only started happening when all these people showed up. It's common sense, and I feel like Nancy's intuition is never wrong. So for the next scene in this episode, we see Nancy taking matters into her own hands, and she puts phosphorescent paint on the broken window, and she has George turn off the lights so she can see who was meddling with the window. And it turns out that it was all the actors because all of their hands are glowing. But they just kind of play it off and Thelma's like, oh, something weird is happening here. But she doesn't want to admit, none of them want to admit that they're guilty of anything. And next we see Nancy and George poring over some old newspaper articles about the first time that murder in the fourth act was put on back in 1957. And it says that the play, sold a lot of tickets, but it wasn't a great success because of little rehearsal time and the actors didn't get along with each other. And so Nancy's like, okay, so River Heights was basically taken for a very expensive ride. It sounds a bit like the scheme from the producers, you can make more money with a flop than you can with a hit, but they also find the name of someone named Jason Hall, and George is like, well, where is he? Everybody else is here, but why isn't he here? So next the show cuts to the scene where Nancy sees all of the actors sneaking out of the theater with a sarcophagus, and Nancy thinks there's a body in it. And she's like, what if Jason Hall is in that sarcophagus? But again, we have another scene of Carson Drew not believing Nancy. This was a little bit hard for me to watch because I was like, Carson and Nancy are usually on the same page. But Carson was just basically like, I find it hard to believe that these 4 millionaires would be capable of this. And I just am like, what makes millionaires exempt from murder exactly? Nothing. That's what. So eventually Nancy does convince them enough to get the police involved. And so they go up to the hotel room where the actors have stashed the sarcophagus and they open it. And there is no body in it, but it's full of bricks. Nancy, of course, is really embarrassed by this, and this was hard to watch because I was like, she's on to something, but of course, they're like, all they can fixate on is there's no body. So we cut to a scene where the play is being put on, and Nancy finds out that the man named Jason Hall, who put on the play back in the 1950s, he made a lot of money, but he cooked the books, and so the actors thought they had killed him, but he got away and has been blackmailing them ever since. He's been blackmailing them about the fact that they thought they murdered him, but Nancy goes out onto stage and she realizes right before they're supposed to drink this wine on the set that it's poisoned by Jason Hall. So the actors, of course, panicked when they heard that the theater was going to get demolished because they knew, or they thought that they had buried Jason Hall in the walls of the theater. And so they came back because Ned was putting on this play to raise money before they demolish it. They didn't want his body to be discovered. So Nancy yells to Ned to turn the house lights down or on, and they see a man in the audience with phosphorescent paint on his hands, and it's Jason Hall. So they catch Jason Hall when he tries to run backstage, and then the actors are just furious at him, and they're like, he blackmailed us, and look, he's wearing a $400 suit, and we've been, penniless for so many years. And it's like, I get what they're saying, but at the same time, it's like, you tried to murder this guy. Like, don't even act like you're completely innocent in this. So the very final scene, we get Nancy talking to all of the actors, and they basically explain that Jason Hall took advantage of them, and Nancy explains that she knew that their wine was poisoned because she's carrying the tray out onto the stage and she smelled what she thought was rat poison. So some of the funnier quotes from this episode. I thought it was funny how Ned started waxing poetic about being a theatrical genius, and Nancy says, when all this is over, I want you to promise you'll do something for me. And Ned says, what? And Nancy says, go see a psychiatrist. One of the actors in the theater group also says, what's suspicious about two men carrying a sarcophagus down an alley at midnight? Touché. And then the last funny quote that I took note of was Janet, and she said, how dare you not be dead? So let's talk about some of the things I liked and things I didn't like from A Haunting We Will Go. So I really liked that there was a group of bad guys. This, like I said, seemed very Agatha Christie or Labyrinth of Lies. It was just like a bunch of people working together towards a common goal, and that was very interesting. As for the things I didn't like, I really didn't like that nobody believed Nancy until later in the episode. Like, Carson didn't believe her, Ned didn't believe her. I think George was the only one that was kind of like, yeah, there may be something to this. Now, as far as the books and games that I think were very similar to this episode, I was reminded a lot of The Final Scene, Message in a Haunted Mansion, and Stay Tuned for Danger, all computer games. And the book that reminded me of this episode was The Clue of the Dancing Puppet, because we deal with a lot of actors in that book, not necessarily puppets in this episode, but honestly, the actors in this episode were kind of like puppets themselves because they were manipulated so long by Jason Hall. So when it comes to the magnifying glass rating that I would give this episode, I would give it 5 magnifying glasses. It kept me on my toes, it was very suspenseful, and I liked all the dynamics between these actors. Like, you knew that they hated each other, but it wasn't until the end that you figured out why. So that concludes today's episode for Season 1, Episode 8, A Haunting We Will Go. Next week, we're going to cover another episode of the 70s TV show, Season 1, Episode 10, Mystery of the Fallen Angels. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.